Hare Krishna, and welcome to our virtual Sunday feast brought to you today from Sage Cottage here in County Wicklow, the Republic of Ireland. I'm Korma Das. Today we're going to be reading from my book, The Great Transcendental Adventure. As you may have been following, this is episode number 7 of our reading of the book, and today we're reading from Chapter 3, which is called The Great Transcendental Adventure Part 1. And if you recall, in our last little chat, we were talking about how the Krishna consciousness movement was established in Australia by the founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada. So these are the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada in Australia and New Zealand. And as I said, today we're going to continue our reading. We've been talking about Srila Prabhupada in Sydney, and now we've moved to the city of Melbourne, where Srila Prabhupada is soon going to arrive, according to the narrative here. But we've been hearing about how many boys and girls have been introduced to Krishna consciousness, and the seeds of Krishna consciousness have been watered by the chanting of Hare Krishna. And we'll start today. We're here in Melbourne in 1972, almost 50 years ago. Quiet, gentle Simon Buttonshaw, also 20, was a talented student from the Victorian College of the Arts. Now in his second last year, Simon was majoring in painting and printmaking. A fellow student had encouraged him to visit the Sunday feasts at the Little Cottage Temple in Carlton. He had also met the devotees chanting in Melbourne City Square and received his first copy of Back to Godhead magazine. Upendra, who was the senior Prabhupada disciple who had moved down to Melbourne to set up the first Hare Krishna temple in Melbourne, Upendra encouraged Simon to use his talents for Krishna. Simon began painting in the small attic above the temple, which was a refurbished garage adjoining the courtyard at the back of the house. Although he was still trying to come to terms with ISKCON's transcendental art, he was attracted to traditional Kangra and Basholi paintings of Krishna. He was very attracted. Yet the old framed Brijbasi print of young baby Krishna holding a parrot that hung in the temple room particularly moved him. Most of all, though, it was Upendra's enchanting stories of Srila Prabhupada that brought Simon closer. Simon recalls, Upendra spent long hours telling me wonderful stories about Srila Prabhupada in San Francisco in the early days. These were rich, detailed narratives told with Upendra's trademark warmth. From these stories, I felt a tangible seed of relationship developing with Srila Prabhupada. I was actually experiencing Srila Prabhupada through Upendra. I would later find that my subsequent association with Srila Prabhupada was consistent with Upendra's initial introduction. Mignon, the first to come and live with the devotees, I spoke about her in our last talk. She was a ballet dancer, a very talented ballet dancer, but she gave that up and moved into the temple. And she was soon joined by Dave, John, and Della, and a young Greek boy, Steve, with his girlfriend, Karen. So all these boys and girls became devotees, became initiated disciples of Srila Prabhupada, and these were their early days. The temple population grew rapidly. Krishna consciousness had certainly taken root in Melbourne. As the devotees became more of a presence in Sydney, so we're flipping over to Sydney here to get a little glimpse of what's going on there, and this will soon become a theme here in this book, harassment of the devotees on Sankirtan. So the early little aroma of that harassment starts Now, as the devotees became more of a presence in Sydney, the Sydney City Council intensified its prosecutions. You'll find that many temples around the world in those early days were harassed by the police. London is a good example, and Australia also. In June of 1971, Chiru and Ajit had appeared in Sydney's Central Court of Petty Sessions, charged under Ordinance Number 30, Section 13, with loitering and obstructing pedestrians in Elizabeth Street and Martin Place. They had to charge us with something, so let's charge them with loitering and obstruction. We were not obstructing, and we were certainly not loitering, but as I said, they had to charge us with something. Sydney City Council bylaws inspectors seemed to be constantly stalking the devotees, and tension was rising. By October 1971, they had been arrested, the devotees, and charged with obstruction on 16 separate occasions. Sydney City Council officials had issued more than 25 summonses against the devotees on charges of loitering and inconveniencing pedestrians. So to cool off, quote unquote, from the city authorities, the devotees started taking longer trips out to the outer suburbs of Sydney. Suburbs like Bankstown, Liverpool, Penrith, and even longer trips to places like Newcastle, Wollongong, and sometimes the national capital, Canberra. They decided to, how should we say, reduce the pressure, bring down the heat a little bit. So they started to spread to these other big towns, and there were devotees there also waiting in the wings, waiting to meet the Sankirtan movement. In each town, the devotees set up an Indian rug in the main square or a disused shopfront, put up pictures of Krishna and Prabhupada, danced and chanted exuberantly, and distributed Back to Godhead magazines. Invariably, their pictures, along with an accompanying article, appeared in the local daily newspaper. City authorities in Melbourne now began to soon realise that the street chanting was going to be a regular affair. Now, almost on a daily basis, police interrupted the kirtans. Without a permit, they said, chanting on the city square was not permissible. Since such a permit could not be granted, the chanters would have to move. So they said, you've got to get a permit to chant. Can you give us a permit? No. What's a chanter to do? The devotees relocated to a small square behind the post office and were again moved on. In a battle of wits, the devotees moved into the post office steps. We used to sit on the post office steps, and our modus operandi was that, well, actually the steps to the post office wasn't state property, it was actually national, federal. It was a federal location. As soon as you stepped onto those steps, we'd been doing our research, it was no longer local government, it was federal government. So what happened? Well, you guessed it. Since it was not state property, they reasoned the Victorian police could not touch them there. But when the federal police arrived, the devotees resolved that it was a time to change their tactics. Although sitting down on an Indian rug with tambura and harmonium was nice, they decided to take to the streets in a procession more often. And that is really in the mood of Nagar Sankirtan, moving, chanting through the streets. Whenever we could, we would like to sit down, but it wasn't the time. Thus, the police had inadvertently promoted the devotees to an even greater prominence as they did the block, so to speak, down Burke Street, left into Elizabeth Street, left into Flinders Street, and back into Swanston Street. That's the main city block in downtown Melbourne. All the while dancing and swaying to the Swami step. But it was not the last that they would hear from the police. Dennis Harrison, Harry to his friends, had taken advantage of the £10 passage scheme and migrated to Australia from northern England. Came from Scunthorpe. You'll guess who I'm talking about sooner or later. He arrived in Sydney by boat in mid-May 1971, only a few days after Srila Prabhupada had departed from there for Calcutta. So he had not come across the devotees before Prabhupada's first visit. His views on life, Harry's views on life, had been recently undergoing rapid changes, symptomized by a growing interest in yoga. I think this is a common theme in devotees' lives. It was a common theme in my life. Suddenly, you become interested in all things alternative. Yoga, Indian music, incense, Indian food, reincarnation, all these different things. All of a sudden, they made a lot of sense. On his very first day in Sydney, he encountered a chanting party of devotees on a busy downtown intersection. Instantly attracted to the chanting, he stood and watched as Vaibhavi Devidasi approached him with a Back to Godhead magazine and invited him to the Sydney Sunday Love Feast. The lights changed and Harry's friends crossed the road. "Come on, Harry, let's go, let's go," they admonished. Harry gave Vaibhavi 40 cents. That's how much the Back to Godhead magazines, that was a good donation for a BTG in those days, 40 cents, and was quickly dragged off by his mates. While staying in a migrant hostel, Harry flicked through the Back to Godhead magazine. The multicoloured front cover displayed Krishna's dancing Rasa Leela with the gopis. I think it was edition number 36. The cowherd damsels of Vrindavan. Everything about the magazine was attractive, but try as he could, the Sanskrit words were all alien and impossible to pronounce, and so the articles remained unintelligible. Nevertheless, he kept the magazine with him. Harry never made it to the Sunday feast, and a few days later he moved to Perth in Western Australia. After working for 6 months in a desolate mining camp in the Hamersley Ranges, Harry decided to return to Sydney to find real spiritual life. Stopping in Melbourne for a 5-hour transit, Harry headed downtown and again encountered the devotees, chanting in the city square to an accompaniment of harmonium and guitar. Harry was exhilarated to meet the devotees again. His repeated readings of his only Back to Godhead magazine were yielding newer and newer realizations. He approached Upananda, standing on the square and holding a big stack of magazines. "Do you have anything there that tells me what is God?" said Harry eagerly. Upananda was excited to meet such an enthusiastic soul and sold him the latest 3 Back to Godhead magazines, speaking to him for a few minutes and pointing out one article based on a lecture by Prabhupada that described the qualities of God. Harry set off to the bank of the nearby Yarra River, sat under a tree, and read the lecture carefully. It's like hearing from Prabhupada. Prabhupada stressed that God was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, and that God was a person. And his name was Krishna. Harry felt a thrill as this truth struck him. Of course, God's a person. It had never occurred to him before. Harry set off for Sydney by train that night, determined to become a devotee. So you probably guessed that Harry, of course, became Hari Sauri Das, who's also written some wonderful books, I think 6 or 7 volumes from his diary about Srila Prabhupada. This is how it all started. Towards the end of December, so we're talking 1971. Did I say 1972 before? Yes, I did. It wasn't quite 1972 yet. It was the end of 1971, just to correct myself. Towards the end of December 1971, despite his regular mood swings, Upendra was able to report to Srila Prabhupada that since the devotees had become more of a presence in Melbourne, so this was December 1971, 50 years ago, literature sales there had been increasing, he told Srila Prabhupada in his letter. Prabhupada replied to Upendra, as Prabhupada always did, always replied to those letters. And here is an excerpt from that letter. With pleasure, I note that Melbourne Temple is going on very nicely under your supervision. Now keep the standard of routine work very high and you will always meet with success. The best news is that you are increasing nicely the distribution of my books and literatures. This is my best activity to distribute solid information about Krishna. Our preaching stands solid on these books. No other movement or cult has had such vast background of authority. So we are not afraid to challenge anyone and everyone to defeat their philosophy on the basis of that authority. Krishna appreciates such strong preachers as his dearmost servants. So let us work very enthusiastically to drive away rascal philosophy and establish the real religion of Bhagavad Gita as it is." Unquote. So by the end of December in 1971, the Melbourne devotees had moved to yet another bigger and better location. This time, a large 10-roomed terrace house in Burnett Street, St Kilda. 14 Burnett Street, St Kilda. Memories. They were busy renovating, constructing a new altar and painting the outside of the building when a letter arrived from Srila Prabhupada for Upendra. Srila Prabhupada reported that Mohanananda, a young and enthusiastic married disciple who had just arrived in Sydney from Los Angeles, had invited Prabhupada to come to Australia. And in that letter, Prabhupada wrote, "I have received yesterday one phone call from Mohanananda in Sydney." Mohanananda was really young and enthusiastic, and he was, well, enthusiasm personified. Big, tall, young man. "I have received yesterday one phone call from Mohanananda in Sydney, inviting me to come there when I leave from here in March." That's March 1972. "I shall be very glad to come there via Hong Kong. You should now make arrangements for 2 tickets from Hong Kong to Australia and then to Tokyo." End of quote. The devotees were ecstatic. Srila Prabhupada would again be visiting them very soon. It wasn't long before the devotees in Sydney and Melbourne were competing to have the nicest temple. That's what we did. Prabhupada approved of the mood. Quote, "I'm encouraged to hear from you that Melbourne Temple is even better than Sydney Temple." And Prabhupada would like play them off against each other nicely so that we would muster up more and more enthusiasm. But he did give us some warnings. "So I must surely come there to see it. Go on like this. Transcendental rivalry, just like San Francisco and Los Angeles. This pleases me very much. But," he said, "it is not that we are envious. No, material envy is not like that. Even the gopis, they were envious of one another, but in a transcendental sense. They were thinking, oh, she has attracted Krishna more than me. That is very nice. She has given him more pleasure than me. Now, let me try more to please him. That is the process," said Srila Prabhupada, "how to improve in Krishna consciousness." End of letter, or end of letter excerpt. The mood of transcendental competition between Melbourne and Sydney encouraged the devotees more and more. Since the devotee chapter were reaching out to the suburbs, the Melbourne branch did likewise, taking towns like Geelong and Ballarat by surprise. Famous, big, bustling cities in Victoria. Both temples were also inspired to improve their standard of deity worship, although Melbourne as yet had no installed deities. Remember, we were reading 1 and 2 episodes ago that Sydney now had Radha Gopinath. Prabhupada had left Radha Gopinath in the, quote, hands of the Malechas, that's us, but yet Melbourne Temple had still no deities. Chitralekha Devidasi, she was married to Upendra, who had left Melbourne when her visa expired, had recently returned again from India. While in Calcutta, she had acquired a very beautiful set of 30-centimeter brass Radha and Krishna deities. you'll still see those beautiful deities of Radha and Krishna on the altar in Melbourne Temple to this very day, along with a variety of articles for deity worship. Articles means equipment, means bell, conch, bathing tanks, all sorts of bits and pieces. Chitralekha supplied us with the very first paraphernalia. Chitralekha was an expert seamstress. She had been well trained in India, and she set about sewing numerous outfits for Radha and Krishna. Now, at this time, I was in Melbourne. I'd moved to Melbourne. And so I was there at this time, and she taught me how to cook some milk sweets, because I was helping with the deity worship. Actually, I couldn't have been helping with the deity worship, because I wasn't second initiated yet, but I was heading that way. So she taught us how to cook, and she taught us how to do deity worship. Upendra had already written to Srila Prabhupada asking if the deities could be installed. So she had the deities, but they hadn't been installed yet. Prabhupada had replied that he would be happy to install them when he came to Melbourne, which he did. Meanwhile, on Prabhupada's advice, Chitralekha started training selected devotees in Melbourne in the art of deity worship, including me, as she had learned from Prabhupada's senior female disciples in India. Particularly expert in cooking, she would demonstrate the timeless art of traditional Bengali sweet making. Rasagula, fresh cheese balls simmered in sugar syrup. Oh, I could do with a few rasgullas right now. Sandesh, a creamy cheese fudge. And burfi, a rich milk confection flavored with cashews, saffron and spices. Got to make some burfi today. Actually, I do have some lovely organic, fresh, whole milk in the fridge that's crying out to be made into burfi. It's on my to-do list. But I digress. On special occasions, she would prepare kamala kheer, an amazing combination of freshly condensed milk and sugar, folded through with little cells of sweet tangerines. She would take the tangerine, she would peel it, and then she would break the tangerine into segments, and then she would peel off the skin from the little segments, and she would break the tangerine segment into little cells, those little sacs that are inside the segment, and she would separate them all. It took hours. And I think she got me to help her once. And then she would make the condensed milk, and then she would fold these through the icy cold condensed milk. And when you ate the condensed milk, the little tiny cells of orange would explode in your mouth. And like a citrus explosion. My goodness. It was quite amazing. A few boys and girls were eager to learn these arts from Chitralekha, who gave her all to train them. I was one of them. I was eager. And it sort of set me up for life, I think. Similarly, in Sydney, devotees were sewing Sri Sri Radha Gopinath new sets of clothes and daily decorating their altar with the profuse frangipanis that bloomed in Sydney's summer heat. I think you know what a frangipani is. It's got an Indian name. But anyway, anyone from tropical places in the world would know what they are, just amazingly, exotically perfumed. And they grow all over Sydney. They too tried their best to improve cooking standards. Okay, so it looks like, from this next quote, it looks like I hadn't quite come to Melbourne yet. But anyway, they too tried their best to improve cooking standards, although they met with an occasional obstacle. Actually, I think I superimposed this little excerpt from when I was in Sydney, because I was in Melbourne at this stage. Korma recalls, we received a circular letter sent originally to Los Angeles from Prabhupada, encouraging us to improve the daily deity worship standards in our temple. Prabhupada had given us some details, and especially he mentioned that we should offer, and we didn't even know how to pronounce it, but it was spelled B-H-O-G. We should offer that to Krishna 5 or 6 times a day. And we presumed it was pronounced bog. Bog. Okay. None of us had ever heard of bog. Was it a vegetable? Was it a sweet? Was it a type of savory? Someone speculated that they thought it was a type of rice. It was actually, but there's a Bengali rice with a similar name called Govinda Bhog. But anyway, we didn't know what bhog was, and we thought it was bog. We looked it up in whatever scant Indian cookbooks we could find, but discovered no recipe. It must be important, we reasoned, because Krishna eats it 5 or 6 times a day. Goodness. We would ask Indian guests who came to the temple, but to no avail. Excuse me, could you tell me what bog is? I am sorry, I'm not knowing these things. And then one day, a devotee who is returning from India told us, bog? Oh, you mean boga. That means unoffered food. We were relieved to discover that despite our ignorance, Radha Gopinath were already regularly receiving ample offerings of boga every day. So, happy ending. Under the management of Upananda, Melbourne Temple's book distribution gathered momentum. Srila Prabhupada expressed his delight in another letter on the 19th of February 1972. So we've moved on to 1972, as I said. This is all chronological. I think that little flashback to the bog story was just the ideal place to put it in the book. So, another letter from Srila Prabhupada. He sent us many letters, actually. This one was sent, as I said, 19th of February 1972. My dear Upananda. Now, this is to Upananda, not Upendra. They're two different people. Upendra is the devotee that was married to Chitralekha, and Upananda, also from America, he was the first brahmachari to join the temple. He was Bhakta Bill. Now he was in charge of book distribution in Melbourne. My dear Upananda, I have noted with pleasure that you are increasing your book distribution and that you have struck at the very heart of the city of Melbourne. That's a quote. That's in quote marks. Struck at the very heart of the city of Melbourne. This was a quote from the article that had appeared in the first Melbourne newspaper article about us. And the writer of the article, and I read it for you last time I spoke, seemed to pick up the mood there very well. And he said, it looks like you've struck at the very heart of Melbourne. So he wrote it in his article, and Prabhupada's quoting him in his letter. That man had really quite understood what we were doing. That you have struck at the very heart of the city of Melbourne, quote unquote. You have understood our philosophy rightly. That we boldly challenge anyone, philosopher, scientist, educationalist, to understand our philosophy, and for that we enter without hesitation into the heart of the biggest cities and preach to anyone and everyone the message of Lord Chaitanya, who himself was like a lion in strength. End of quote. In Sydney, so we're bouncing back here, Sydney, Melbourne. These were the twin cities. These were the only two cities in Melbourne with a in Australia with a temple, and they were competing with each other. And this was exhilarating. So back in Sydney now. In Sydney, tall, red-headed Mohanananda had a vast reservoir of energy and enthusiasm, as well as substantial entrepreneurial skills. He and his wife Shasti had brought incredible vision and optimism to the temple, especially since they had just come from the Los Angeles temple, which was the forerunner in all things new, revolutionary, and exciting in ISKCON. His ideas were endless. Some, like that of staging a Krishna-conscious rock opera inspired by Hair, never left the ground. We weren't quite ready for that. Others soared. Devotees enthusiastically embraced his plan to inaugurate a travelling bus program. It would be a veritable Hare Krishna temple on wheels, Mohanananda said. And indeed it was. And it was revolutionary. It really took off. Big story. An old Sydney double-decker bus was soon located. Big, cumbersome double-decker buses that used to drive all around Sydney, and I always used to think that they're going to topple over, but they never did. I think they were heavily weighted, but they were quite tall and lanky. It was in need of a little repair and substantial refurbishment, but the temple had no money. We had no money. We sold back to Godheads and made, $20 a day. But we had to pay the rent, we had to buy the food, We had to cook the bog, or the boga. So we had to. Where was this money going to come from? But Krishna has a way of reciprocating with the devotees. Harry, remember Harry? Harry was regularly attending the Sydney temple at Glebe, chanting Hare Krishna, doing a little service, and generally enjoying the association of the devotees. Still with long hair, way past his shoulders, he was waiting for his friends to arrive back in Sydney so he could hand over his apartments to them and move into the temple. One day he chanced to overhear a conversation between Charu and Mohanananda. The temple was 3 months in arrears in rent. They'd found a suitable bus, but it would cost them $1,000 to purchase. Harry had some money in the bank that he'd saved while working in the Western Australian mining camp. He stood nearby until Charu and Mohanananda noticed him. "What do you want?" said Mohanananda, eyeing Harry suspiciously. "Well," Harry replied, "I just heard you talking about money, and well, I've got some money in the bank." Charu and Mohanananda listened intently. "How much money?" asked Mohanananda, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, about $1,500, answered Harry. Mohanananda leapt in the air, shouting, "Krishna!" on the top of his lungs, and then he checked himself and sat down, clearing his throat. Where is the money?" he asked quietly. "Oh, it's in the bank. I can bring it tomorrow if you like." "Oh, Charu can drive you to the bank right now." Harry assured them that it was all right. "I'll bring it in the morning," he said. I think Charu and Mohanananda had probably a sleepless night. The next day, as promised, Harry arrived with his bank book. Remember bank books? The days of the bank book. Charu drove him to the bank, and as he watched, Harry withdrew all of his savings and closed the account. Turning to Charu, he happily handed over the money. Crisp bills. No credit cards in those days, of course. The bus was soon purchased. So I couldn't think of a nicer way to hand over your life savings towards... That bus was responsible for making dozens and dozens and dozens of devotees, spreading the holy names all around Australia. So it was a very, very good contribution. The devotees worked hard to transform the bus into a travelling temple. The seats were removed, both upstairs and down, and Prabhupada even sat in it and we drove him somewhere in that bus. The bus did good service. On the top floor, devotees laid a white pine wood floor and varnished it to a mirror finish. An altar was installed at the front and cooking facilities arranged at the rear. So we could cook in it. We had a temple in it. It was amazing. The lower deck was carpeted, leaving 2 seats over the back wheel arches. The windows were curtained throughout. The entire bus was repainted. The cream and saffron exterior was emblazoned with the Hare Krishna movement in very large lettering. Below, slightly smaller, it read, "The Positive Alternative." Even in ISKCON's early days, Prabhupada had intimated that he preferred to hand over the management of the society to his senior men. By doing this, he could be free to finish translating the Srimad Bhagavatam. Nevertheless, Prabhupada's day-to-day letters from his disciples were still filled with questions that could be quite competently answered by the senior devotees. In reply to such a letter sent from Upendra, Srila Prabhupada wrote, quote, "I never asked my spiritual master any question except one. How shall I serve you? So in this way, kindly inform the others that I may be relieved to give you so many more nice books. That is my real desire." Interestingly, Prabhupada, at this point, 1972, it was still too early to relieve the devotees of their management. So Prabhupada had to continue at the helm of his movement. Prabhupada said on a number of occasions that he would rather just be writing because he wanted to finish the whole Srimad Bhagavatam and many other things. But we were not capable of running the whole society on our own at this stage. Mohanananda appeared to be taking an overall managerial role in Australia, although he was not officially a GBC member. Srila Prabhupada was happy with the situation, and he also wanted his senior disciples in Australia to give him some relief by taking the burden of day-to-day management on their shoulders. He also requested Mohanananda in the same vein as he had to Upendra. He said, "I'm an old man now, and my interests are turning to philosophy and translation. If you help me by relieving me from the administrative work, that will free me to give you so many more fine books on Vedic literature and from our own devotional line. So kindly assist me in this way." Actually, if you simply serve in a surrendered attitude and go on chanting regularly, the answers to everything will come out automatically. In other words, he's saying, you have so many questions, but if you read my books every day, those questions will be answered. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me, quote unquote. Of course, Prabhupada's quoting from Bhagavad Gita, 10th chapter. I better make sure that is the 10th chapter. Yes, 10th chapter. While Sydney Temple had its bus, the Melbourne devotees were quick to discover exciting new ways of spreading Krishna consciousness. The Sunbury Rock Festival. I think this was one of Australia's earliest rock festivals. I think they were trying to do something like, what's it called? You know the one. And my cameraman's mouthing the words, but I can't read them. Woodstock. Australia was trying to have its own Woodstock. And it was done in a place called Sunbury. Similar sort of place, out in the country a little bit, just outside Melbourne. It attracted thousands of young people. Not as many as Woodstock, of course. The devotees were there with a tent, distributing prasadam, magazines and books, speaking to the cast of Hair. The musical Hair was in Australia, and all the American cast had visited the rock festival, and we were chatting with the cast of Hair, giving them prasadam, chanting and displaying a multicolored banner emblazoned with the words, "Prabhupada is coming." So we wanted to let people know, and we thought, well, all these young people here, that they need to know that Prabhupada's coming. I wasn't there at the rock festival, or was I? I was there for one day, I think. On Labor Day, devotees chanted as crowds of tens of thousands assembled to witness the famous Moomba parade. Moomba, it's an Aboriginal word. And the original name was given to our festival, the Moomba parade, because some Aboriginal elders told the original managers of the festival that the word Moomba means let's get together and have fun. So they called it Moomba. Later on, many decades later, they found out it meant something rude. But they called it Moomba Parade. And later on, the devotees were a huge presence at that Moomba Parade, distributing tons of prasadam and kirtan in front of tens and tens of thousands of people. The Moomba Parade was broadcast on national television, and it was everywhere. So we were there at one of the early Moomba parades through the streets of downtown Melbourne. The devotees sold scores of books and magazines, bringing in the largest ever one-day collection for Melbourne, $400. My goodness, we hadn't ever seen $400. Melbourne Temple conceived of yet another new innovation, street plays in the city square. Yes. Although they were basically unrehearsed, ad-libbed affairs, certainly ad-libbed, they inspired a great deal of enthusiasm amongst the devotees and attracted huge crowds. Traditional stories told by Prabhupada like Liquid Beauty and The Boatman. These are well-known stories that are even put together for plays and dramas to this very day in ISKCON. They were favourites. Other homespun tales, loosely based on the scriptures, were inspired by eccentric, newly arrived Hanuman Das, a feisty French-Canadian who added to the repertoire. Korma recalls, I remember one play in particular. Hanuman wanted to tell a tale illustrating the fragile, temporary nature of the life of a downtrodden soul in this world. He had me play a tiny, downtrodden soul. I guess he looked at me and thought, well, this guy looks like he could play that part well. So here I was. And somehow Hanuman convinced me to dress in a nappy. That's right, you heard it right. Oh, man. A nappy and gumboots. And nothing more. What was he thinking? What was I thinking? So there I was, in a nappy and gumboots, and shaved head, of course. They hired a hospital bed. And it gets more crazy. Why? But they hired a hospital bed and wheeled me. I was lying on the hospital bed in a nappy, in my gumboots, and they wheeled me up Swanston Street to the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, where they staged this crazy play in the busy cafeteria during lunch. Oh. Anyway, here I was, in my nappy and gumboots. Everyone was trying to have their lunch, and I guess I was entertainment. Needless to say, it got a huge crowd, and we sold lots of Back to Godhead magazines, but I would have preferred something a bit more traditional. End of quote by Korma. Yes. On the 28th of February 1972, the day celebrated as Gaura Purnima, the holy appearance day of Lord Chaitanya, the bus took its inaugural drive through downtown Sydney. That was a big day. Some devotees held a huge kirtan on the lower floor, and others, hanging out of the rear emergency exit upstairs, scattered flower petals and packets of prasadam. I think it was peanuts or raisins, or peanuts and raisins. There was date balls and coconut honey balls, and we were throwing them out the back window on the crowds. Amongst the bewildered shoppers and office workers below, I'm sure they were bewildered. There was all these bald, shiny, bald-headed people leaning out of a bus, throwing things at them. And hopefully some of that prasadam got eaten. The bus soon attracted media attention, prompting television news coverage. It was huge because we didn't have a TV, but we were told about it. Twice a day, the bus dropped off the devotees downtown for their regular chanting and magazine distribution, picking them up for lunch, and again at the end of the day. It was actually spectacular. It was spectacular. You could fit all the devotees in one bus, and devotees were eager to get on the bus because it was so much fun. So you'd get loads and loads more devotees out there on Sankirtan. And then we'd sit down in a park, and then the bus would drive up again, and it was with lunch. And they'd roll out a rug or something, and then they'd bring out all the containers and the bread and the dal and the rice, and we'd all have lunch in a park somewhere underneath a tree. And then we'd go back and get on go back to our chanting, and the bus would drive back to the temple, and then it would come back again and pick us up again at the end of the day. It was actually remarkable. So much fun. Mohanananda and Charu soon discovered an even more exciting use for the bus. It just gets better and better. Devotees had been visiting the Domain. Remember the Domain? It was a huge park in downtown Sydney. I mean, really huge. Something like 50 acres or 100 acres. It was massive. And it was where everybody went on the weekends, off to the Domain. Devotees had been visiting the Domain regularly every Sunday since Bali Mardana and Upendra had first come across it 2 years before. This was 2 years after the devotees had arrived in Australia. Each Sunday, as it pulled in behind the Sydney Eye Hospital and parked under the giant Moreton Bay fig trees there, the devotees would leap off the bus, stormtrooper style, heralded by the blasts of conch shells and billowing dense clouds of spiritual sky incense. Special incense like watermelon and patchouli and all our favourite flavours. Because we had our own incense factory in Sydney Temple at that stage, where we made spiritual sky incense. And we sold it in many shops and made a lot of money from it, actually. The devotees carried assorted paraphernalia, a giant wooden sign displaying the Maha Mantra in large letters, I remember one of my first services at the temple was to help write out the Maha Mantra on a piece of hessian, and it was transferred to a wooden frame. And I didn't have very good handwriting, but somehow I got the job. They carried assorted paraphernalia, a giant wooden sign displaying the Maha Mantra in large letters. That sign took over from my little sign. That wasn't mine. That sign quietly disappeared sometime before. Pictures of Prabhupada and various colourful framed posters of Krishna mounted on boards and held head high on poles. So we really made an impression when we leapt out of this bus and tried to basically took over the domain. The devotees looked exotic. The men with their shiny shaven heads, tilak and saffron cloth, and the ladies with colourful saris and basketfuls of simply wonderfuls. They chanted loudly to the accompaniment of several drums and numerous pairs of hand cymbals. In those days, it wasn't a kirtan unless you had like 15 pairs of kartals, so it was pretty loud. As they entered the park waving flags and banners, the large party of devotees attracted an instant huge crowd. As they chanted and danced in a circle, the crowd of onlookers swelled. The audience was mixed. Young lovers, arm in arm, tourists, kids licking ice creams, older people out for a stroll, whole families on a Sunday outing, and even policemen. While beer-bellied Aussie drinkers, old Bolsheviks and tattooed hooligans yelled abuse, barefoot hippies and sat grooving with the mantra. When the devotees stopped, Charu immediately climbed a stepladder, because that's what you did in those days. Everybody brought a stepladder, and the taller stepladder you could stand on, so you could be standing out on top of the stepladder and people could see you, and they would immediately be attracted. What's that guy doing what's he talking about? Let's go and listen to him. So it was all these people dotted through the park, standing on stepladders. Let's see what they have to say. Charu immediately climbed a stepladder and loudly addressed the crowd. Sometimes he dramatically recited stories from the Krishna book through a megaphone. He had a megaphone. Man, we were fired up. His favourite story was the story of Devivida the gorilla, because that story is just outrageous. And he'd read the whole story from the Bhagavatam, and people were just standing there, because Charu did it very dramatically. He harangued the crowd with stimulating and thought-provoking philosophy. This, as usual, proved stiff competition for Webster. Webster was a larrikin, loudmouth, foul-mouthed, nasty person. We spoke about him in our last talk. He was the one that complained about the devotees burning incense at the Wayside Chapel. And he asked Prabhupada, "What good is this chanting?" And Prabhupada shouted very loudly at Webster, "It saves you from death." So even though Webster got to sit down and hear from Prabhupada, he wasn't very nice and he wasn't very respectful. And he would every week be there, and we would compete with Webster as to who could attract the biggest crowd. After about an hour, the devotees would hold a roaring grand finale kirtan, and Charu would announce as loudly as possible to the crowd, "You're all invited back to the temple for a free love feast." He would do it in his megaphone. Devotees would cheer and whistle. "There's our bus," Charu would say, pointing at the bus. "Pile on board. Come on, get on now. There's plenty of room. We'll even drop you back here in the park afterwards." It was a very attractive offer. Sometimes the bus will be filled with 80 people, and we bring them all back to the Sunday feast. We'd drop you back here afterwards, and we did. For many, this was their first introduction to Krishna consciousness. The Reverend Dr. Ian Hunter recalls, "I was an Army Reserve chaplain at the time." This is how he spoke, by the way. "One Sunday I was strolling about the domain with 4 or 5 colleagues when I espied the devotees chanting. After standing and watching them for a little while, a devotee loudly and enthusiastically invited everyone back to the temple for the Sunday feast. People started scrambling aboard, and I can clearly remember that I too wanted to hop aboard the bus and go back to the temple. I almost made it, but my friends had made other plans for us that night. And interestingly, the Reverend Dr. Ian Hunter later became a very, very friendly, congregational, you could almost say congregational devotee. He came seriously in touch with the devotees 20 years later, and he started chanting and doing all sorts of devotional things. So from that first meeting in the park, it was about 15 years later, I think, that he showed up at the temple. For many, however, the offer was too good to refuse. Sometimes 60 to 80, occasionally 100 curious and hungry guests would squeeze into the bus and attend the burgeoning Sunday feast program at the Glebe cottage. The varied crowd, literally picked up at random from the park. You can imagine, some of them were drunk, some of them were intoxicated in various ways, some of them were just coming for a laugh, some of them were actually real seekers. So it was a mixed bag. And when you sat down to take prasadam with these people after the feast, well, you realize some of these guys are total nutters. Some of them are, high. Some of them are who knows what. But it was made for a very interesting, and as I mentioned here in the book, a salty question time after the Sunday lecture. But most differences would evaporate over subjis, papadums, halva, sweet rice, and the crowd stopping. Simply wonderfuls. Devotees realized the greatest potential of the travelling bus program when in early March they used it to go up the coast of New South Wales. Sydney's on the coast, all the way up the coast, the far east coast of Australia, many towns. And they went on their inaugural trip to Brisbane. If you haven't been there before, you may pronounce it Brisbane, but it's actually pronounced Brisbane. Just like Melbourne is pronounced Melbourne, and Brisbane, well, I think it was never pronounced Brisbane, but Brisbane. Australians like to drop as many syllables as they can. And just a few days before, a shipment of small books had arrived. Devotees were excited, since they had only ever distributed Back to Godhead magazines. But now, they had Easy Journey to Other Planets and Krishna Consciousness, the Topmost Yoga System. These were the first little books that we got in Australia. It was very exciting because we only had Back to Godhead magazines, and all of a sudden, these brilliant little tiny paperbacks, powerful excerpts from Prabhupada's lectures that were transformed into these first little books. Easy Journey to Other Planets, very, very powerful book. And Krishna Consciousness, the Topmost Yoga System, both attractively presented with full colour covers. Temple members had swelled from 12 devotees to over 30. Consequently, 18 brahmacharis were free to travel on the bus. After stopping in Newcastle, the bus drove almost non-stop, arriving in Brisbane late one night. Next morning, Mohanananda took care to approach the local police to inform them of his plans. Since the Queensland police were notorious for strictly enforcing rules, Queensland police were famous. They were so heavy and they were so strict. They were really, really, really heavy dudes. The Queensland, they had these laws about assembly, and you couldn't assemble together on the street for any reason whatsoever. So, Mohanananda decided to be low-key. Since the Queensland police were notorious for strictly enforcing strict rules governing lawful assembly, Mohanananda was decidedly low-key in his descriptions to the officer at the desk. "We're monks from Sydney," he said. "We'll be here for 2 or 3 days. We have these books and we sing on the street a bit." Miraculously, the officer thought it would not be a problem. He introduced Mohanananda to the sergeant, adding that the monks were a bit like those Hare Krishnas from Sydney, and that they would like a permit. And the sergeant was equally agreeable. "Sure, no worries," he said. Not only did he grant them a permit, but several police cars escorted the bus downtown and arranged parking. Oh, man. I mean, this was remarkable. I mean, in Brisbane, of all places, where, if 2 people stood and talked together, they'd get the attention of the police. And they escorted the bus, almost like an escort. It was an escort. To avoid obstructing pedestrians with the numerous book boxes, the police suggested that maybe they could help by allowing the devotees to store the boxes of books in the boots of the police cars. And this is a true story. I mean, this is mind-blowing. And they did. For 2 days, devotees caused a sensation in Brisbane as a large kirtan party of 15 weaved its way through the downtown shopping area. The rest of the devotees who sold books to the incredulous crowds who lined up, literally lined up 20 or 30 at a time to buy them. They did. Literally lined up with their money in their hands. People jostled, eager to find out more. Was it a circus? Is this a movie promotion? Some wondered. Harry, with his freshly shaven head, had recently moved into the temple and had worked on the bus refurbishment. Not only did Harry buy the bus or give all the money for the bus, but he was a mechanic and he helped refurbish it. Harry, he was still Harry at that time, he could hardly tear open the boxes quick enough. 60 cents each or 2 for $1, cried Harry. As one box would empty, a devotee would run to the police car. Excuse me, it's just so remarkable. Open the boot of the police car and take out another box, giving a nod to the constable, who would give him a wink back. After 2 days, all the books were gone, and the devotees, exhilarated with their success, returned to Sydney. On their arrival, they were greeted with auspicious news. Prabhupada was coming. Mohanananda had written expressing the devotees' eagerness to see Srila Prabhupada in Australia again. Prabhupada had reciprocated their feelings. Quote, "With pleasure," said Srila Prabhupada, "I have noted that you are desiring to be personally present with me again, and I am also looking forward to seeing you, all you nice boys and girls, in Australia again." So we'll finish there, and next episode, which is episode number 8, we'll hear all about Prabhupada's second visit to Australia. And whereas in Prabhupada's first visit to Australia, he visited Sydney, in his second visit to Australia, he visited Sydney and Melbourne, or Melbourne. And that was one of the most exciting visits that I can recall. Actually, wonderfully, Prabhupada visited Australia 6 times, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, and 1976. So you can just imagine. That's why this is such a thick book, because there was so much went on. And you can read all about it, or you can hear all about it, starting with next week's exciting episode of The Great Transcendental Adventure. So stay tuned. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you very much.